At dawn, a vessel measuring 120 feet in length, bearing a striking red and white hull, made its approach. This Norwegian ship, named the Kvitungen, carried 6 men on its deck. They were armed with Mauser rifles, loaded with 7.62mm rounds. Alongside these firearms, they carried 4-foot iron clubs known as hakapeaks, tools designed to dispatch a seal with a singular, decisive impact. These individuals had been dispatched from Norway for a mission sanctioned, financed, and fully cleared by the British government. Their objective lay just a few nautical miles to the north, scattered across rocky beaches. 6,000 gray seals. Neither harbor authorities nor maritime patrols impeded the ship's journey. The Royal Navy was not mobilized, and no police officials boarded. On paper, this operation appeared entirely unimpeded. Yet, as the Kvitungen neared the initial breeding island, the hunters sighted something on the rocks that brought their mission to an abrupt halt before a single shot could be fired. It was neither officials nor soldiers, but something altogether different. This is the chronicle of how a small band of ordinary island residents, possessing no weaponry, no legal mandate, and no backing from London, managed to dismantle a prime minister's strategic directive. It unfolds as the narrative of the most modest form of dissent imaginable, enacted at Britain's far northern reaches during the autumn of 1978. And it delves into the subsequent events, a recovery of such magnitude that it now reshapes the very coastline of an entire nation. This is not a fanciful tale. It is thoroughly documented history. The marine mammal Britain had earmarked for removal bears a Latin designation that almost sounds like a jest: Halichoerus grypus, colloquially known as the hook-nosed sea pig, or simply the gray seal. Formally, it was already under protection. Britain had placed it on the protected species list in 1914, marking one of the earliest wildlife safeguarding measures in British law. However, by the mid-1970s, that protective framework had developed a chasm wide enough for a Norwegian trawler to navigate through. This significant vulnerability was attributed to the fishing industry. Scotland's reserves of whitefish and salmon were in sharp decline. Trawler fleets, spanning from Peterhead to Kirkwall, consistently returned with ever lighter hauls year after year. Fishermen sought a scapegoat, and the seal presented an all-too-convenient target. An adult gray seal consumes approximately 4 to 7 kilograms of fish daily. Multiply that by 14,500 breeding animals solely on Orkney, and the political calculus becomes immediately apparent. The mounting pressure converged on the desk of Bruce Millen, then the Secretary of State for Scotland within Jim Callaghan's Labour government. It emanated from the influential Scottish fishing lobby. Support for this measure also came from the Scottish National Party, whose political assent was intrinsically tied to advocating for Scottish fisheries. Furthermore, newspapers consistently ran headlines linking seal populations to job losses in coastal communities. Confronting a looming general election in fewer than 12 months, Millen accessed. The Scottish office authorized a large-scale culling operation. 6,000 gray seals were slated for removal in and around Orkney. This initiative called for the dispatch of 900 mothers and 1,700 pups in the initial phase, carried out by seasoned professionals. An additional 3,200 pups were to be removed by locally licensed hunters. These pups were newborns, merely 3 to 4 weeks of age, still occupying the beaches where they were born, and still clad in their distinctive white lanugo coats. However, the Scottish office encountered an unforeseen obstacle. British fishermen expressed reluctance to undertake the culling themselves. It was one thing to assign blame to a seal. It was quite another to walk onto a beach with a club and carry out the act. Consequently, the government resorted to a historical precedent. It contacted Norway. Norway possessed extensive prior experience in such operations. Annually, Norwegian sealers journeyed to the formidable pack ice of Newfoundland, Greenland, and the White Sea, culling harp and hooded seals by the tens of thousands. They stood as the world's foremost experts in commercial seal hunting, and they possessed the requisite equipment. The Mauser rifle they carried was chambered for 7.62mm ammunition, the very same round employed by NATO infantry. The projectile was specifically engineered to penetrate a wet skull at close quarters. The hakapick, by contrast, was an older, cruder, and more elemental tool. It consisted of a 4-foot hardwood shaft, tipped with a hooked iron spike at one end, and a hammered iron ball at the other. The ball was used to crush the pup's skull, while the hook served to drag the carcass back to the vessel. The Kvitbjorn, a name translating to Little White One in Norwegian, embarked from Bergen in late October of 1978. Aboard were 6 professional hunters, a captain, and a sufficient quantity of ammunition to complete the first phase of the culling operation within 3 weeks' time. Upon their arrival at Orkney, they found the archipelago enveloped in a thick fog and freezing rain. Such conditions were commonplace. The North Sea in October is far from a hospitable environment. What was decidedly atypical, what caused the ship's captain to pause as he raised his binoculars, was the sight along the ridgeline above the seal colony on their primary target island. He discerned tents, then he began counting individuals, small figures moving with deliberate caution among the seals. These were neither hunters, nor officials, nor uniformed officers, but simply people in wool jumpers and oilskins, positioned squarely between the Kvitbjorn and the marine mammals it had been dispatched to remove. The captain radioed the Scottish office, inquiring about the proper course of action. The reply, when it came, was that no one possessed an answer. Orkney is a diminutive archipelago, home to approximately 20,000 people dispersed across 70 islands, most of which remain uninhabited. In the autumn of 1978, around 150 of these islanders, a diverse group including farmers, educators, fishermen, schoolchildren, and a retired clergyman, made their way by foot, by boat, and even by swimming to the breeding islands, where they resolutely refused to depart. Their strategy was straightforward. Gray seal pups, in their initial weeks of life, react with panic in the presence of humans. If an individual walked slowly through a breeding colony, the mothers would instinctively herd their pups towards the water. A frightened seal in the water becomes an animal a hunter cannot effectively target at close range from a beach. A culling operation dependent on marshalling newborn animals on land simply cannot proceed if the animals are not there. So, the islanders undertook the only remaining action. They erected their tents on the beaches. They slept alongside the seals. They prepared meals, dined, walked, conversed, and maintained a quiet yet persistent presence, 24 hours a day, within the designated target zone. The Kvitungen found it impossible to deploy its hunters without literally stepping over these human obstacles. Then, a second development occurred. A 500-ton trawler, proudly displaying a green flag, arrived from the south. Its name was the Rainbow Warrior. Its crew of 14 members belonged to a nascent organization called Greenpeace. They strategically deployed inflatable boats between the Kvitungen and the shoreline. They meticulously documented every moment on film. 3 boatloads of journalists soon followed, accompanied by helicopters and light aircraft. What had been conceived as a discreet commercial undertaking on a secluded Scottish coast had, within 72 hours, become front-page news in every newspaper across Britain. Joe Grimmond, the Liberal Member of Parliament for Orkney, rose in Westminster to question the genuine necessity of such a mass culling. The International Union for Conservation of Nature, the very body that would later establish the Red List of endangered species, lodged a formal objection. Environmental organizations, faith groups, animal welfare charities, and thousands of personal letters flooded Downing Street. The Kvitungen never landed. Jim Callaghan's Labour government was merely 15 months away from a general election. His parliamentary majority was tenuous, and his approval ratings were declining. The last thing he needed in the autumn of 1978 was a photograph of newborn white seal pups being struck down on a Scottish beach, captured by a Greenpeace crew, and splashed across the front page of every Sunday newspaper nationwide. He canceled the operation. The Scottish office rescinded the culling permit. The Kvitungen reversed course and sailed back to Norway, its cargo hold unused. The 6,000 seals it had been sent to remove survived the winter. Yet this is not the conclusion of the story. It is barely the beginning. For what the Orkney protest of 1978 truly accomplished was not merely saving 6,000 seals. 6,000 seals is merely a figure. What it preserved was a fundamental principle. It established the precedent that a British government in the contemporary era could not order the widespread culling of a protected species without incurring a political cost that no post-war prime minister proved willing to bear. Every subsequent proposal for culling, and there have been many, has been confronted with the specter of that same photograph in the same newspapers. A decade later, in the summer of 1988, a virus known as phocine distemper spread throughout the North Sea. It claimed the lives of roughly 18,000 common seals across northern Europe. Orkney's beaches became strewn with deceased pups, prompting a local resident named Ross Flett, who had been among the islanders standing between the Kvitungen and the colonies a decade prior, to conclude that protest alone was insufficient. He co-founded the Orkney Seal Rescue on the island of South Ronaldsay and commenced the more painstaking work of individually assisting animals, one at a time. Here is what transpired next. It took decades for the results to become evident, and it defied every model the fisheries scientists had employed to justify the earlier culling. At the turn of the 20th century, the population of gray seals in British waters had plummeted to roughly 500 individuals. 500. Not colonies, but isolated individuals. The species had been pursued, clubbed, and shot for its meat, hide, and oil for such an extended period, and by so many, that Britain's Protection Act of 1914 was enacted to prevent outright extinction, rather than to merely manage abundance. By 1978, that protective measure had helped elevate the worldwide population to approximately 100,000 animals. Britain's share constituted around 14,500 breeding gray seals on Orkney. This was the population against which the ill-fated culling was calculated. However, the culling failed, and once it failed, the protection endured. And once the protection endured, the animals did what animals naturally do when no one is actively pursuing them. They rebounded. The most recent assessments place the British grey seal population at approximately 120,000 animals. 95% of Europe's grey seals now breed along the coasts of Britain, with the overwhelming majority of these breeding in Scotland. 2 out of every 5 grey seals alive on Earth today inhabit the rocky shores of the Scottish coast. Orkney alone hosts roughly a third of the global population during breeding season. The archipelago that 6 professional hunters were dispatched to clear now supports one of the most concentrated populations of large marine mammals anywhere in the Northern Hemisphere. The fishing industry that vigorously lobbied for the culling has, over the same period, contracted by more than half, not due to seals, but because of decades of overfishing, a phenomenon with which seals had no connection. Ross Flett, now in his 70s, continues to operate the Orkney Seal Rescue with his partner, largely sustained by donations. Locals affectionately refer to him as the Seal Man. Every autumn, as the pupping season commences and the beaches turn white with newborns, his phone invariably rings. A pup separated from its mother by a storm, a weaner entangled in monofilament, a yearling bearing an injury, for even now, the pursuit of seals has not entirely ceased. Salmon farms in Scottish coastal waters are still, under specific licenses, permitted to remove seals that enter their enclosures. But the scale is now measured in individual instances, not in thousands. The Kvitungen does not return, the Scottish office does not telephone Bergen, and every October, the very same beaches that 6 armed men were sent to clear resound with the ancient calls they have made for 10,000 years. There exists a photograph, captured in October of 1978, depicting a young woman in a red jumper, seated cross-legged on wet basalt, wrapped against the biting wind. A gray seal pup rests peacefully asleep against her thigh. She performs no action. She carries no placard. She utters no shouts. She is simply present, a silent sentinel positioned between a rifle and a life, for precisely as long as it takes. That is the embodiment of an ordinary individual when they steadfastly refuse to yield. The Kvitungen sailed homeward. The pups matured. Their descendants, 10, 20, and 30 generations later, now populate 95% of Europe's gray seal breeding grounds. They thrive there because 150 people in wool jumpers and oilskins decided they needed no government permission to safeguard a coastline. Sometimes, the most modest act of defiance is the one that endures. If this journey into a pivotal moment in conservation resonated with you, consider subscribing to our channel for more stories that illuminate the less traveled paths of history and nature.